Then functional areas of the cerebral cortex are the motor, sensory, and association. This motor area directs the skeletal or voluntary muscle movements. So this motor are responsible for the muscle movements or voluntary skeletal movements. Then sensory are, this will receive and decode the sensory impulse and enabling the sensory perception. Then association means it is concerned with the integration and processing of complex mental functions, okay, such as intelligence, memory, memory, judgment, emotions, reasoning, etc. So let's first see what are the motor areas. The motor areas are the primary motor area and the broadcast area. That is the motor speech area. The first one is the primary motor area. It will lie in the frontal lobe immediately anterior to the central sulcus. So it will lie in the frontal lobe, this primary motor area. This primary motor area has two neurons which are involved in the pathway to the skeletal muscles. So here there are two neurons which are involved. There is upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. So we can see in the picture, in the motor nerve pathway, first the impulse will come from the brain, okay. Suppose the impulse is coming from the right side of the brain. That means it will travel from the upper motor neuron will travel from the right side of the brain, and it will continue till the medulla oblongata. From the medulla oblongata, it will cross, it will cross its side. The upper motor neuron, which is coming from the right side of the brain, from the medulla, it will cross its side, it will change to the opposite side, okay. And the upper motor neuron, which is coming from the left side, it will, when reaching the medulla, it will cross in the opposite side. So from the right side, upper motor neuron will come, then when it reaches the medulla, it will come in the left side. From the left side, it will go to the from the left side, it will continue with the lower motor neuron, okay. The lower motor neuron will transfer the impulse to the target muscles, okay. So like this, the opposite side of the brain will control the opposite side of our body. The upper motor neuron descends from the motor cortex through the internal capsule to the medulla. Here it crosses to the opposite side and descends in the spinal cord. At the appropriate level in the spinal cord, it synapses with the second neuron, that is lower motor neuron, which leaves the spinal cord and travels to the target muscle. So when an impulse is coming from the left side of the brain through the upper motor neuron, the upper motor neuron will travel to the medulla. Then after reaching the medulla, it will cross the opposite side, that is it will come to the right side of the brain. Then from the right side of the brain, it will synapse with the lower motor neuron, okay. When reaching the spinal cord, after reaching the spinal cord, it will synapse with the lower motor neuron. Then the lower motor neuron on the opposite side, that is on the right side, okay. Then after it reaches the right side, it will cause the this one, it will send the impulses to the target muscles on the right side of the body. So this is the motor nerve pathway. Next is the broadcast area or the motor speech area. This is situated in the frontal lobe just above the lateral sulcus and controls the muscle movements needed for speech. Next is the sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. So we have learned the motor area of the cerebral cortex, which are the primary motor area and the broadcast area. So in the sensory areas, there are 5 areas. That is the somatosensory area, auditory area, olfactory area, visual area, and the taste area. So these are all related with the sensory. So these are known as the sensory areas. First one is the somatosensory area. Okay, it lies immediately behind the central sulcus. Here, the sensations of the pain, temperature, pressure, and touch, awareness of muscular movement, and position of joints, proprioception are received. perceived. Okay, so here it is area where the sensation of pain, temperature, pressure, touch. Okay, when someone touches us, or when we are in pain, so when we what we can identify whether the temperature is hot or cold, or the position of the joints and movements. So these all are controlled by this somatosensory area. Then next is the auditory area. It lies immediately below the central sulcus. So this auditory area will receive and interpret the impulses transmitted from the inner ear by the cochlear part of the vestibulocochlear nerve. So this vestibulocochlear nerve, this is the 8th cranial nerve, which will pass impulses to the cochlear, from the cochlear part of the inner ear to the brain. So this auditory area, which lies immediately below the central sulcus, this will receive and interpret the auditory impulses. The next is olfactory. Olfactory means it is related to the smell. Okay, it lies deeply within the temporal lobe. So these impulses from the nose are transmitted through the olfactory nerves and received and interpreted. So this olfactory nerve is the first cranial nerve. So this will pass the impulse from the nose to the brain, and the brain, so these impulses are received and interpreted. Then next is the visual area. So this is responsible for our vision. So the nerves responsible are the optic nerves, which will pass from the eye and receive and interpret the impulses as the visual impressions. Then next is the taste area, which lies above the central sulcus. It will pass impulses from the sensory receptors in taste buds and receive and perceive as taste. So these 5 senses we should remember. First one is the somatosensory, which are responsible for pain, temperature, pressure, proprioception. Okay, then auditory area for hearing, then visual area for vision, taste area for taste, then olfactory area for the smell. Then next is association areas. First we have learned the motor areas, then sensory area, then the association areas. These association areas are responsible for the higher functions such as intelligence, judgment, emotions, etc. Okay, so here also there are 4 main areas. These are the premotor area, prefrontal area, Wernicke's area, and parieto-occipito-temporal area. So this premotor area, what they will do, this will coordinate the movements initiated by the primary motor cortex, ensuring that learned pattern of movements can be repeated. So this premotor area will be responsible for the things which we have previously learned and which we are repeatedly doing. Okay, like tying of shoelaces, writing. Okay, so these activities are controlled by the premotor area. Then prefrontal area, this will involve with the intellectual functions. So the higher intellectual functions that we are able to perform, like reading, and by keeping in our mind the various things in our brain, these intellectual functions are controlled by this prefrontal area. Then next is the Wernicke's area, or the sensory speech area. So these are known as the sensory speech area. So our words which are spoken and comprehension, these are all identified by this Wernicke's area. So here we have learned the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. Broca's area is known as the motor speech area, and which is under the motor area. Then Wernicke's area is the sensory speech area, which is under the association area. So in the exam, when it is asked, write a short note on Broca's area, or write for 2 marks, it can be asked for 1 marks or 5 marks. Okay, when it is asked, okay, you should be able to identify what is Broca's area, what is Wernicke's area, because they have the separate names. Like the motor speech area is known as the Broca's area, and Wernicke's area is known as the sensory speech. So this Wernicke's area are responsible for the sensory speech which are perceived. Then next is the parieto occipitotemporal area. This will the function of this area are spatial awareness, like interpreting written language and ability to name the objects. So these are about the areas of the cerebral cortex. So next is the diencephalon. This diencephalon is a part of the brain that connects the cerebrum and the midbrain. Okay, it consists of two structures which lie around the third ventricles, that are the thalamus and hypothalamus. This diencephalon is composed of the two structures known as the hypothalamus and thalamus. So let us see what is the thalamus. This thalamus consists of two masses of gray and white matter situated within the cerebral hemisphere just below the corpus callosum, one on each side of the third ventricle. So this thalamus consists of two masses of gray and white matter which are situated within the central hemispheres. Then sensory receptors in the skin and viscera send information about touch, pain, temperature, and input from the special sense organs travel to the thalamus where there is recognition. So this thalamus is known as the relay station. So when the sensory when we apply any stimulus in the skin, like when we apply a hot temperature, a hot glass of water in our hand, then it will provide this message will be passed through the thalamus first. Okay, so this thalamus will relay and redistribute the impulses from part of the brain to the cerebral cortex. So this will pass the sensory receptors. Then next is the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is a small but important structure. Then it weighs around 7 grams and consists of a number of nuclei. It is situated below and in front of the thalamus, immediately above the pituitary gland. So this hypothalamus is linked to the pituitary gland. Okay, it is linked to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland by the nerve fibers and to the anterior lobe by a complex system of blood vessels. Okay, through these connections, the hypothalamus controls the output of hormones from both lobes of the pituitary gland. So this hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland, is linked to the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is divided into anterior lobe and posterior lobe. So from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, it is connected, and the hypothalamus is connected by the blood vessels. Then from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus is connected by the nerve fibers. So all the hormones which are secreted from the pituitary gland, okay, these are passed through the hypothalamus only, and then this hypothalamus will control the output of the hormones from the pituitary gland and pass to the rest parts of the body. Then next is the brainstem. Under the brainstem, there are three main structures, that is the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain it is the area of the brain situated around the cerebral aqueduct between the cerebrum above the pons. So this midbrain will lie above the pons and around the cerebral aqueduct. It consists of the nuclei and nerve fibers which connects the cerebrum with the lower parts of the brain with the spinal cord. Okay, so this will consist of the nerve fibers and nuclei which will connect the cerebrum with the spinal with the lower parts of the brain, like pons and medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. Then next is the pons. The pons is situated in front of the cerebellum. Okay, the cerebellum, we have known what is we'll discuss later on the cerebellum. Okay, this pons is situated just in front of the cerebellum, between below the midbrain. Okay, below the midbrain and above the medulla oblongata. Under the pons lies the medulla oblongata, and above it lies the midbrain. So it consists of mainly the nerve fibers or the white matter. Okay, this will consist of the white matter that form a bridge between the two hemispheres of the cerebellum, and of the fibers passing between the higher levels of the brain and the spinal cord. So this will consist of the white matter which will form a bridge between the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. Then next is the medulla oblongata. It will extend from the pons above and continues with the spinal cord below. So we should continue like the brainstem is composed of midbrain, pons, and medulla. So these structures are located just behind each other. Okay, first midbrain, then second next to it lies the pons, then next lies the medulla oblongata, then next to the medulla oblongata lies the spinal cord. It is continuous with the spinal cord. Okay, it is this medulla oblongata is about 2.5 centimeter long and lies within the cranium above the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is where the brainstem will. This is a hole this is a hole in which the spinal cord will come out of the this one structure from the brainstem, okay, to the areas of our back vertebrae. Okay, so this medulla oblongata within the cranium above the foramen magnum it will lie. Then the outer aspect is composed of white matter. Okay, so the outer aspect of the medulla, likewise in the brain, the outer portion is covered by the gray matter and the inner portion is covered by the white. So here the outer aspect is covered by the white matter and gray matter will lie centrally, and it will continue like that in the spinal cord also. Okay, these are responsible for the medulla oblongata. These are also known as the centers for the cardiovascular center, respiratory center, then reflex centers of vomiting, coughing, sneezing, and swallowing. So all these activities of the cardiovascular, respiratory, vomiting, coughing, sneezing, swallowing, all these are controlled by the medulla oblongata. Next is the cerebellum, which lies just below the cerebrum. The cerebellum is situated behind the pons. Okay, the pons lies anteriorly to the cerebellum. Okay, which means the cerebellum will lie behind the pons and immediately below the posterior portion of the cerebrum. Okay, occupying the posterior cranial fossa. So it will lie just posterior to the cerebrum. It is ovoid in shape and has two hemispheres. So in the cerebellum also there are two hemispheres which are separated by a narrow strip known as the vermis. Okay, so likewise in the brain also it is separated into two cerebral hemispheres, which are the left and right cerebral hemisphere, which are separated by the longitudinal fissure. Likewise, this cerebellum is also separated into two by the vermis. Then here in the cerebellum also the gray matter forms a surface and the white matter will lie